Welcome everyone to another exciting episode of the None of Our Businesses YouTube show and podcast. I'm Ty Carr, and with me today is Charlie Ziegman.
Hi, everybody.
And Jack DiMatteo.
Hello.
And we've got a bunch of current events in the news, business, some taxes, all that kind of stuff to talk about, of course, from the perspective of three accountants. Okay, we're going to be talking about Kaizen, the Japanese word change for the better. And we've been talking in recent podcasts, and really more than recent, we've been talking for a year about AI and automation. It's been a common thing for us, and maybe it's something to look out for, potentially even be afraid of, but not this week. This week, we're afraid of mosquitoes instead of robots. Then we're going to talk about the Pac-Man Defense, which is used against a hostile takeover in large business M&A activity. We're going to talk about support for landlords. Is it something coming? Is it something that's needed? And the economy of Star Trek. Does it make any sense? Well, for that matter, does our current economy make any sense? And in case you missed it, the IRS moved the April 15th deadline to May 17th. So all of that, from our perspectives, here we go. Let's get it going with Charlie.
All right, everybody. I want to take a minute and ask you if you guys have ever talked about our Lord and Savior Kaizen. I found a Wikipedia article called Kaizen, and it's focused on it's a Japanese word, and it means change for the better. And I know a lot of people in business school have probably heard about this before, but I don't know if it really gets talked about outside of that field that much. Basically, it's this idea that change that happens in an organization should be done at a very small level and work its way. It should come from both sides of the organization, from the lower level workers suggesting changes that work their way up through the chain, and from the top level down as well. And so it's kind of an interesting take because, so often when we hear about change, we're talking about like total organization restructuring and different, kind of revamping the whole system. But this really takes that idea and turns it on its head and says that if people on the front line are seeing things that need to change, they should gather the people around them and get kind of people engaged in that change, and then they should plan, do, check, and act. That's the 4-step process that they give for how you should implement change in an organization. They have this process they call the 5 whys, where they're basically trying, anytime there's a failure, they look at they ask themselves 5 questions that help to try to get at what the root cause of that failure is, and that helps drive what the change is. And so I guess I just want to get your guys' take on, how you think change should be implemented in an organization. Does it need to be this overarching thing, or is it instead maybe something that happens at a smaller level and should be more kind of pervasive in the organization structure?
I've always heard, I've heard of Kaizen events, and I never really understood the methodology behind it, but I guess when it comes to change, didn't realize there was a word for it, but the approach that you're describing is the approach that I've always taken. I used to go into places, you'd be putting in a new computer system, or you'd be changing processes, and a lot of people want to come out and announce, to everybody, geez, we're making change. And right away, when people hear that, that's when they start digging in their toes. So, I've always seen it work incrementally. You're better off not building a lot of fanfare around it, just building it into your day as part of what you do. What you tell people you have to change, that first thing they do is dig in their toes, and they don't want to change. So I think the approach is, I've seen it in action, over the course of my career. That's kind of always been the approach I've taken. I remember, years ago working for a CFO directly on a project for a big a retailer with many locations, and it was funny is you'd go through his advice was, if you change 10 things and it by accident works, you don't know which one of the 10 things or which common. You really don't know what worked. So you make one change and kind of see how that works and tinker. So I'm a big advocate of the approach because I've seen it work the best over time.
I think making incremental. It reminds me, like, how do you compare like Kaizen to the to that minimum viable product approach and from Silicon Valley, right? Like, because it feels a little bit similar to me in that regard of making kind of small incremental changes and seeing how does that actually, how to not trying to bite off too much at once, waiting to see how everything around it affects it before you kind of try the next change. In the minimum viable approach, it's very market facing, right? So the whole thing is wait to see what your customers tell you, wait to see what the market tells you the change needs to be. I suppose that Kaizen is more production and manufacturing oriented. So it's more about seeing what your internal operations kind of tells you that the changes need to be. But yeah, it kind of feels like a similar philosophy to me in that regard.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think they're kind of come from that same concept of, just wanting to utilize the scientific method, focus on one thing at a time, and just kind of, be an agent for change. I just thought it was interesting. And I think it applies to a lot of walks of life because you can kind of use this approach in anything that you do. I'm not saying that I'm good at doing it, but I think that I can see how others are able to, not get overwhelmed by things by just focusing in on the little bits here and there. All right. Do you have another article we can talk about, Jack?
I sure do. Last week we were afraid because the robots were coming. Well, this week the mosquitoes are coming. They found another species of mosquito down in the Everglades in Florida, and they're afraid they could be bringing diseases that we haven't seen in this country for years: malaria, yellow fever. And I guess if I'd have seen an article like this 2 years ago, I wouldn't have paid much mind to it. But I think if we learned nothing in the last year, I guess the takeaway for me last year was I never would have thought a virus could topple this economy and the world economy like it did. So if you look at something like with what, a mosquito coming in and malaria, yellow fever, whatever that looks like, I can maybe see a different reaction in this country if it starts to spread, things getting shut down. I mean, it is in Florida. It's big tourist destination, not only for people in the United States, from all over the world. It may not reach the level, but there again, I mean, even in the summertime, that could spread through this country. So I'm just, I see things like that now, and I see the reaction last year to COVID, and I just wonder if we're not more vulnerable to things like this than we would have thought at one point in time, and if there'll be a different reaction to this. I mean, we may never hear about it again. I forget what it was. It was a killer wasp or something they were talking about with COVID, but COVID kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the room. They weren't talking about anything else, and nothing really ever came of it. But I'm just wondering if you guys sense that we could have a different approach to things like a new species of bee or mosquito or something like that bringing disease, and how do we get ahead of it, and how do we stop it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful that we've learned enough through this whole pandemic to be better prepared to react to that. But at the same time, kind of the pessimist in me sees this as like, oh, that sounds exactly like what would happen next is a mosquito swarm floods the country, and then we just have this entirely new, unrelated pandemic to deal with. And so I'm kind of mixed between those two feelings, but I do think we're better prepared, and I do think it sounds exactly like what our life will be soon.
Mosquitoes swarming the country. So are we going to get malaria? I'm gonna probe you on that doesn't sound good, but I'm going to probe you on this article, Jack. What are we scared of? Just being itchy, or are we scared of malaria? Or
what the article said was things like malaria and yellow fever we haven't really seen in this country for years, and they see the threat of this mosquito being able to bring that and seeing outbreaks that we haven't seen in years. So that's and what I could say is the fact that we haven't seen it in years. What's going to be the response to it, and hopefully not an overreaction to it. And can you keep it contained in Florida? I would think I've always heard it, related to the tropics or those types of climates, but it's weird, shifting weather patterns, things get hot and sticky all over the country. Are they going to expand outside of Florida? So, kind of interesting, but like I said, I wouldn't probably have paid much attention to an article like that 2 years ago. But with what we saw last year, I think probably every one of these is going to at least raise an eyebrow.
Well, it reminds me, a few years ago, they had the whole Zika thing. I don't know if you remember that, but the Zika was like this big thing that everyone was worried about. And I was traveling back then I was traveling to the Caribbean every year for vacation, and so that was definitely on my mind. But then even without traveling to the Caribbean, it was like I think we were hearing about it like migrating really far north, like northern states were like concerned that Zika would be a problem for them too. So yeah, and I guess from an economic standpoint, it's that we've seen what this last year has done to us with the pandemic from an economic standpoint. A mosquito-borne illness just kind of ravaging the country could be an economic problem for sure, but it also makes me think, well, it could also be like a whole new market of opportunities, right? Because there's whole industry, I'm sure, around managing mosquitoes and all of that if you're in mosquito prone areas. And so I think the rest of the country might be opened up to those markets if we're all afraid of what that looks like for the rest of us who aren't used to worrying so much about mosquito-borne illness. So yeah, I think it's probably a mixed bag on the economic impact of something like that.
Well, it's interesting when you brought up Zika. You reminded me of West Nile virus from not too many years ago. And remember, it would be rough on humans, but I don't think it was deadly. But where it was really kind of deadly was with horses. And following thoroughbreds like I do, there were some thoroughbreds that, I mean, you could lose a horse to something like that. So it was. I remember at the time, and I guess if you were a person and you contracted it, you chances were you were going to survive it, but it would rack you up pretty bad. But
right. So the economic impact of mosquitoes, it's not just human illness. It's it could affect livestock and other things too. Yeah, I hadn't considered that.
Charlie, what else have you got for us this week?
I've got a whole different article to talk about. Found kind of interesting. I was searching Wikipedia for financial articles or for business articles in general, and I found one that I had never really heard before and wanted to see if you guys had heard much about this idea. But it's called the Pac-Man Defense. And what it is it's a defense strategy that businesses use when they're going to get bought out in a hostile takeover, and they try to acquire the would-be acquirer by basically leveraging themselves and buying into the other company until that then turns the tide of them trying to take over. And so I kind of thought about this for a little bit and it didn't make a lot of sense to me, because it seems like if one's buying the other, how does the one being bought threaten the other? And so the article gives some examples, and I kind of have to read as to go through it because there's a lot of little things. But basically, there's an example where internationally what happened was that there were Porsche and Volkswagen, in which Porsche attempted to lead a hostile takeover of the much larger Volkswagen. And so I've kind of summarized what happened. Porsche tries to take over Volkswagen. Banks called all of Porsche's loans in the middle of that process. The Volkswagen chair and Porsche, who happened to also be lineage of the Porsche fortune, decided then to loan Porsche a bunch of money to pay the banks, and they end up eventually merging with Volkswagen, becoming the survivor. But it was just an example of this kind of strategy at play. And so I want to get your take, Jack, in particular, and see if this is something that you've come across before or heard about, or if it's something that really just doesn't come up in the small to medium-sized businesses, or, what you think about it.
Well, I think with the small to medium-sized businesses with private ownership, you're not really going to see it so much. But when you have these public companies, it's a whole different thing. And generally when you have, an acquirer, they're going after a target. It'll be a matter of, they're debt ridden. Their results aren't very, very good. I mean, if they're a private company and are doing very well, it would be very hard for somebody to come in and try to do a hostile takeover. I mean, it's a private company. When you get to these public companies, it becomes a little more different. And in the case you're talking about two public companies. So, I mean, I guess everything's fair game. If somebody's looking to acquire somebody else and they see a synergy there, and somebody doesn't want to be acquired, I mean, you're going to arm yourself with whatever weapons you have. But, if you're the smaller one, I mean, it sounded like in the article too, they're taking a lot of debt to to almost, I mean, in the past, it used to be a poison pill was the way you'd use defense, where it's like you could put some things in place where if they acquired you, there could be some triggers that right off the bat, that new company would be in a lot of trouble because of some of the poison pills or triggers you put in place. I mean, this is kind of an interesting one, but I'm kind of where you are. I'm kind of intrigued by it because if you're somebody who's vulnerable to begin with for maybe being way too much in debt, shrinking market share, whatever the case may be, I'm not really sure where you find the wherewithal to be able to fend off an acquisition like this.
Yeah, I mean, this seems to be more of the purview of kind of the large company merger and acquisition kind of scenarios in terms of forcing an acquisition kind of thing, right? Because in most scenario, generally in the small business environment, nobody's going to acquire you unless you want them to acquire you. I guess from a technical standpoint, I should say that, right? But in the large business M&A environment, it's actually possible that you could, management could essentially, the company could get acquired out from under management without them necessarily wanting it to go that way. But that's from an operational standpoint or a logistics standpoint, not a likely thing to happen in the small to mid-sized business environment. You're not really defending yourself in the small to mid-sized business environment. You're not really defending yourself against a hostile takeover. Hostile takeovers aren't really a thing in that environment. It's just a question of if you're trying to sell your company, or if you need to sell your company, or you could be in the small to mid-sized business environment, you could be put in a position where, Jack was talking about the company that just has too much debt service, has cash flow problems. You may be put in a position where you have to sell your company and you don't want to, but you realize that's the only way out for you. That's the only way to get out and maybe have something for retirement, in the small business environment, is to just kind of give in and sell. And that kind of thing happens, but you're still kind of controlling a lot of the parameters in that scenario. And so, I think that's interesting to kind of think about the differences in scale and how your strategies could be radically different depending on scale. And I'd never heard the term a Pac-Man defense, but that's great. The idea of, we'll just turn around and get bigger and eat you before you eat us, right? Is the idea.
It's funny. It almost, when you kind of remember when you're talking about M&A tie, and that's the other thing that we've heard in the past, the white knight, right? So you don't think you have the resources to fight somebody, and so you go out and you've got to find your own M&A or PE firm or investors to stave that off. But then at that point, maybe it becomes pick your poison. But if you don't, you're a publicly held company. If somebody's got the resources to take you over, they're going to do it. So you've got options. You either fight. This is kind of interesting to fight back, but in a lot of those scenarios, I'm pretty sure you're going to have to reach out to find somebody else with some deep pockets to be able to hold them at bay. It's going to be tough to do it on your own.
Yeah, and the article definitely made mention of that. So I saw that come into play there too. And I think that's like you said, picking the lesser of two evils there, and maybe part of a bigger overall picture, because one company's getting acquired, but it maybe plays part of in a brand of multiple companies. Might be worth having someone else be the acquirer. I can see how that could happen. All right. Do you have another article we can talk about, Jack?
Sure do. I have another one that I think speaks to a lot of different things. I mean, we've talked quite a bit on this show how there's a disconnect between what you see in the stock market and Wall Street and what you really see on Main Street. This article talks about relief for landlords and how tough that is. And if you look at what the unemployment is, but I guess if you look at these stimulus things and some of the unemployment numbers, because I've talked to employers, and right now they're people that I've hired people in the sweet spot where they get an extra $600 a week. Those people don't necessarily want to go back to work. So they're having a hard time finding people. So I guess in that regard, that's how people are being paid rent. But it sounds like a lot of these landlords are struggling, and they're kind of in a tough situation, because even if you evict somebody, can you find somebody to replace them who's working? And right away, a lot of people say, well, we had this pandemic. You should give relief to people from paying their rent. But, unfortunately, a lot of these small landlords, at some point, the buck's got to stop somewhere. Somebody's holding the paper on that. So it's either going to be with, the bank's not giving those landlords, 8 months not to pay their mortgage. They still have a mortgage to pay. So, I'm just looking at one of these things where it's, and I've personally run into it where, in a foreclosure situation, you kind of see it in real estate right now. You may be better off if you own a house, because I think it'll be a lot longer to get thrown out of it than if you rent, because I think these landlords still have the tools to be able to put eviction notices in place a lot quicker than a bank can turn around and do a foreclosure. So, you don't, this is weird. This is one of these articles that you really don't hear a lot about. And I have to think it's really more commonplace. And you have a lot of these small landlords that are really kind of struggling because they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Do you evict these people? I mean, they're kind of scraping by from month to month. And I'm just kind of curious what you guys have heard on the rental market, and if you see similar or hear similar stories.
Well, there's been eviction moratoriums placed in by state governments and by the federal government. So it's created a scenario that has been a little bit of a more scary environment for your small landlords, because they could get into a scenario where they are having to pay the bank the mortgage on the properties that they own, but they're not getting rent and they can't evict because there was moratoriums placed on that due to the pandemic. And I think, I forget when the federal one is supposed to come to an end. There's been a federal one. I think it's supposed to come to an end in the next few months or so. But I think, it's like the sensibility is kind of like, well, if you're a landlord, you automatically have the money to weather this, or if you don't have the money to weather this, you just shouldn't be a landlord, kind of thing. And maybe that's true. And I think that's probably an issue that some landlords are probably thinking through now is, being a landlord, being a small landlord, putting your investment into owning a rental property, owning as part of your overall portfolio, is that really a viable passive investment when the society's kind of view, perspective, or attitude toward you is that they're going to treat you like you're like a large residential corporate rental company, even in terms of how they kind of think about the economics on this. So I think kind of the idea of some support for landlords, I think, is for rental property owners is a great idea in that regard, because I think a lot of that discussion did leave the small rental property owners, the ones that own a few properties or just one. I mean, how many people out there just own like one rental property as just a passive investment, right? But they're not particularly wealthy necessarily, and so they need the rent to pay their mortgage, and so that really puts them in a tough spot. Of course, there's also been opportunities to get forbearance on your mortgages as well, but it's a tough spot, because the proposition of these rental moratoriums has been, well, you can't evict somebody during this period of time where we're all in this together, we're all struggling, but if they're not paying rent once the moratorium's over, then the renter is supposed to somehow magically be able to pay all this back rent that they haven't been paying, right? And it's like it's ridiculous, right? And so you look at it and you're like, well, if you own one property as a passive investment, you're counting on that property to pay the mortgage, you're counting on the rent. The renter's stiffing you because they're taking advantage of these rules that have been put in place to give them relief. And you go to the bank and you get forbearance. So at first it seems like you're in the same position, right? It's like the renter doesn't pay you as the property owner and you don't pay the bank, but we know who gets left holding the bag, because, at the end of this whole thing, when the moratorium's over, the renter probably hasn't been saving this money or has no way to actually pay you this money all at the end. And so, and then you have to pay the bank, right? You have to pay the bank back all the amounts that they have deferred for you, and you still have no way to do that, right? So yeah, it's I think any support in that area would be welcome. Fortunately, I don't know of anyone specifically who suffered from this. Thank you. But but I can only, you know that there are some out there that are. So I feel for them. I'm sorry to hear it. I've been sorry to see it unfolding as it has.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those interesting things where like society as a whole has this class structure built into the landlord tenant relationship to where it's one of the very few business models where government will intervene so directly in that way. And it's interesting because like a moratorium, which is supposed to provide assistance to the people who are being protected by it, if you really think about it, it just kind of moves the problem around. There's no actual assistance in that story to the group as a whole. Now, to the individual, of course, he's not getting kicked out, so it helps. But really, moratorium just says we're going to just push the problem, like you said, onto the landlord, and which will ultimately push it to the bank. And so, yeah, it seems like the real answer here is some actual support. Let's just all agree on what actual support looks like. And a moratorium maybe isn't it.
Well, it's interesting because I mean I remember hearing a story years ago when we had the financial crisis, and there was a husband and wife team. Both of them were professionals. Both of them made good money, and they were building themselves up a nice little portfolio of rental properties. Well, when the financial crisis hit and people were out of work, nobody could pay, but they still were on the hook for those mortgages. So they ended up declaring bankruptcy, going belly up. I mean, and it's a risky business. I mean, it's people sit back and the land, like Ty was saying, the landlord, they got the money to weather the storm. It's kind of like we talk all the time about raising wages or some of the other costs or regulations you want to put on small business, and it's like, okay, they just go out behind their business and pick a few bucks off their money tree, and it just doesn't work that way. And thankfully, I always stuck to house flipping, but people would act like you couldn't lose money renting. And one of the things I could never understand with this model is if you were to walk into a Walmart, damage some shelves, do some damage, the police couldn't get there fast enough to throw you in cuffs and haul you away. But meanwhile, you hear stories all the time about, the renter that wasn't going to leave. And when they finally did leave, they smashed out windows, they ripped out plumbing, they poured concrete in the toilet. I mean, they did $10,000 worth of damage. And nobody ever seems to go after them. So I thankfully have shied away from being one of these smaller landlords, but it doesn't seem to be. Hearing articles like this certainly makes me think that I don't want to go into that space. Charlie, how about you? Do you have another article for us this week?
Well, all these money problems would just disappear if we just all had replicators that we could then take any item and put it in and just have two of them. Do you agree, with that? Because that's what the article is talking about here in the Screen Rant. It's looking at 10 hilarious ways that Star Trek's economy makes no sense. And so one of the things in the Star Trek universe is that apparently there's no currency, and that's like a big part of the whole dream of Star Trek. But what the article looks at is that actually you can't get away from the idea of currency because there's like 10 ways in which it's still basically part of their system. I won't go through the whole list, but it talks about they have like this social credit system. And so people who don't have material needs are still trading ultimately for the prestige or for, to have social cred. They talk about self-actualization, that in a way, having just feeling like you have a purpose can be a form of currency that you then chase and still ends up functioning the same way that a currency would. Talked about a couple of other different things, but I guess I want to get your guys' take on what is currency really? Can you get away from it? Does having something that isn't money and it's points or it's, your own social credit, is that actually possible? Or is it just the case that we all are going to use money regardless of what we call it, and different systems are really just fancy ways to look at the same thing, which is currency?
Well, I think I guess in my mind, I think what's interesting about what we might give Star Trek's economy credit for is that it, like they're talking about, it still has a system of like ranking and creating status and all that. But under our current system of currency, we combine two different things at this point, right? Like right now, we combine the media or the mechanism by which we satisfy our basic wants and needs. We do that through currency. and then we turn around and then we also very much use currency as status and to do a lot that has nothing to do with our basic wants and needs, right? And so I think what's interesting is not the question of can you do away with currency altogether, but to me the more interesting question at this point is can you bifurcate those two different purposes? Can you have, because that's kind of what the replicators do in the Star Trek universe, right? Is that they basically say, well, nobody in the Star Trek universe has to go without clothes or without food or anything like that because it's so easy to just replicate it, right? And but to the point of that article, it's like, but humans still like to rank each other against each other, right? And we still like to have a methodology of demonstrating our progress towards higher achievements and all that sort of thing, right? And so I think that is also very interestingly to me, that's how I see the world we live in today too, right? It's like so much of what we do with money has very little to do these days with meeting our basic wants and needs. Some of it does, but not all of it. And so I think that'd be the interesting question. Can those two things be separated in today's world?
I think it's interesting the premise you raised. Does the Star Trek economy make sense? I wake up now wondering if our economy makes any sense with some of the things we see on a daily basis. But to Ty's point, I mean, there's always that base currency. I mean, you watch an episode of Gunsmoke. Here comes a saddle tramp, and what does he do? Hey, I'll give you a day at work so I can eat a good meal. I mean, that's currency. He's trading that work for that good meal, and he's on his way. So at that most rudimentary level, there's always some exchange of value or services or goods. I guess on the other end of it, the uber rich and goes back to ancient times. It is that status symbol. But I mean down at its core, it always seems to be some kind of currency, whether it's a day at work or what it is. And I'm not sure I can imagine a scenario where we get away from that.
Yeah, I agree. I think those are all really good points and interesting to think about, and maybe going to make me go watch an episode of Star Trek just to kind of see what's going on there. All right. Any other articles we can talk about?
Yeah, I got one more for you guys. We would be remiss to not point out that we're sitting here mid-March, and the IRS has announced a delay in the tax filing deadline from April 15th to, let me make sure I say this right, to a new deadline of May 17th. So they're extending it about a month there. And yeah, I mean, it's like, is that, I guess the question, lots of things that can be said about this, but the questions on the table for this would be, is that really helpful? I mean, if you're sitting here March 15th, I guess there's probably some folks that are still sweating whether they can get to the April 15th deadline or not. So maybe that is a little bit helpful. But it extends filing the 2020 tax return and settling your tax bill. Of course, we have a pay-as-you-go system, so in theory, you would have paid in most of what you owe for 2020 already, and if you haven't, then you're subject to penalties anyway on that. And on the flip side of that, what's interesting about this is that it is an extension of the filing deadline for 2020, but it doesn't affect the estimated tax payment deadline for 2021. So if you're not an employee who gets all your taxes withheld through wages, if you're a business owner or a self-employed or freelancer, contractor, whatever, and you're used to paying your estimated tax payments, typically, or just an investor, a lot of times you might pay estimated tax payments. Typically, you're trying to figure out what your first quarter estimate, say for 2021, where we're at right now, you're trying to figure that out based in part on your 2020 taxes, right? So it kind of leads to an interesting conundrum there of okay, well, if you're not filing your 2020 tax return until May, but you got to come up with your first quarter estimate for 2021 right now, coming up in April, how exactly do you do that? And does that mean that the extension is not all that helpful for you, right? Maybe so. I bet there's a lot of taxpayers where that's their conclusion. is crud. We have to do this anyway to come up with our estimate. So let's just get it done. So yeah, I don't know. And I can only imagine what our colleagues who prepare taxes as their profession, and that's what they're deep in the middle of. I bet it's a mixed bag of feelings on this, but I can guarantee they're not all happy about an extended deadline, because many of them were looking forward to the finish line, driving both them and their clients to get information in to get done by April 15th. And now with this extension, it just kind of drags the whole process on another month for them. I bet many of them are feeling that way. But yeah, what do you guys think about this?
Yeah, I think that if I was in the tax prep field, I would definitely not be looking forward to the fact of having busy season extended another month, and in a way that is very, I don't want to say haphazard, because I mean, they're just trying to administer aid, but it's not a planned thing. And so I just think it makes things harder. I personally get real attached to kind of the deadline, or like you said, the finish line. And I think, yeah, having that in sight makes the days better. And so it's moving that goalpost is not fun. And yeah, I can also see a lot of clients pushing the providing of workings in 28 days into that 30-day timeline. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. What do you think, Jack?
Well, the accountants I talked to, they were dreading this. They were hoping this wasn't going to happen, and lo and behold, it did. And I think just for all the reasons everybody stated, I mean, it's just you're pushing it back for another month. I don't know that substantively you're really fixing anything. I guess I would look at it from another way. I mean, what I see more and more with people on a daily basis is they're trying to get back to normal. And this is just another thing where, well, this doesn't get us back to normal. This prolongs the misery of the tax season another 30 days. And I'm not really sure functionally, like you said, people are preparing to pay their taxes. I'm not sure that there was I know they did just pass some legislation that has some retroactive changes in it. I haven't read this or seen this. I'll throw this out there. If you're somebody that drew unemployment last year and you filed early and you paid tax on that unemployment, I've heard that in that legislation, retroactively, you're going to get your money back. That's going to be handled by the IRS. The IRS says don't file an amended return. Actually, I heard this from the tax accountant in my BNI group this morning. They say don't file that amended return, that they'll handle that internally. You'll get refunded that money. But as far as pushing back the deadline, as far as interpreting the rules or anything like that, I still think we were far enough away from the April 15th deadline, and people were already pushing towards that. So I'm not sure fundamentally that this fixed all that much. And for my money, it just seems like it's just another thing that pushes us further away from getting back to normal. So I don't see a whole lot of benefit to pushing back the deadline.
I kind of wonder if the IRS somewhat did it for themselves too, because I think I've been seeing some articles about how people haven't been getting their refunds, and people haven't, and some people who filed their tax returns on the extended deadline for 2019 still haven't gotten completion or refunds on some of those. And so, yeah, it makes me wonder if the IRS's backlog, there were articles, up to the last few months that the IRS has had this massive backlog. Yeah, I wonder if they look at this as a release valve for themselves. If it's like, well, if we can just delay people turning in more tax returns for another month, that'll give us a chance to catch up. I don't know that that's the case. I'm just throwing it out there. I have no idea, but it seems like that could be part of what is motivating this.
It certainly wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, that sounds exactly right. I got to say, I agree with that. And just like with the rent moratorium we talked about earlier, taking your problems and pushing them back a month and then asking if you have the wherewithal to handle them at that time usually doesn't work out. Obviously, we're only talking a month here and a different issue, but yeah, it seems like kicking the can down the road in general is not always great. We should all be more like Ned Flanders. It's January 1st, time to get those taxes in, Nettie. All right, everybody, this has been another episode of the None of Our Businesses YouTube show and podcast. Tune in again next week for more business updates from an accountant's perspective. Thanks for watching.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.